This panel in particular is really kind of representative of the ecosystem that we are engaged with across education and thinking about these key issues and important issues. And so I'm going to introduce the folks first, and then they'll pick up with their own comments. We have 5 panelists for this session. We will be joined by, I'm going to get to the right side of my agenda to make sure I can introduce them correctly. This is the order in which they'll be speaking as well, so you can know who they are. But we have Steve Smith, who is the Chief Information Officer of the Cambridge, Massachusetts, here in the United States, Public Schools, as well as one of the lead participants in the Access for Learning community. We'll have Dr. Andrew Rice, who's the CEO of Education Analytics. We have Julia Fallon, who is the Executive Director of the State Educational Technology Directors Association, or SETDA, here in the United States. We will have Sara Kloek, who's the Vice President of Education and Children's Policy from the SIIA, which is the Software Industry and Information Association. And then we'll be joined virtually by Maria Langworthy, who's one of the principal project managers and leaders of some activities within Microsoft Education. So we're pleased to have them all join us. Ask questions in the chat virtually. We'll bring those forth. And then in the room, but we have about an hour for this panel, so I will turn it over to Steve and say thank you to all the panelists in advance.
Great, thank you, Dale. It's a pleasure to be here. I threw together some notes just from this morning as I was listening. I didn't know what I was going to talk about till I got here. So a little bit more about me. I'm going to talk specifically about like grassroots at the district level addressing privacy and some of the things we've been doing through the Student Data Privacy Consortium, part of Access for Learning. As Dale said, I'm the Chief Information Officer in Cambridge Public Schools in Massachusetts, and I've been there 16 years. And prior to that, I was a CTO in a rural district in Maine for 11 years. So was it Jim earlier was talking about the different types of districts, you know, rural and urban, poor and rich. I've experienced all 4 of those between those 2 districts. I mean, the amount of money spent on a student in the district I was in Maine, Cambridge spends 4 to 5 times amount per year, you know, on the student. So there's a big difference. But the issues are the same, just that, you know, the smaller districts don't have the resources. And the other thing I wanted to mention, I don't know if Mark is still here or not, but I've also been the LEA rep to the NCES forum for over 20 years. I represented Maine and Massachusetts. And I would agree that some pieces of it should be blown up and rebuilt together. So in Cambridge, like I said, I started there 16 years ago. When I came to Cambridge 16 years ago, just because of the community that Cambridge is, very academic, always pushing and asking questions, privacy was a concern back then. The parents were already asking what's going on with our children's data, you know, going into these applications in the cloud. So we had to kind of get out in front of it and start building processes and practices to ensure that the data was being properly protected with the ed tech vendors that we were sharing data with, as well as other community vendors, wherever our data was going. I used to kind of literally think about, you know, the ecosystem in Cambridge, where is the data leaking out, and is it being protected properly? So over a number of years, we built processes to vet applications and start dealing with privacy agreements with vendors. And to make a long story short, that morphed into the creation of the Student Data Privacy Consortium under Access for Learning. Access for Learning is, some of you probably know, but maybe not everyone, is one of those standards organizations that were referenced to earlier. Used to be known as the SIF Association, but has changed to Access for Learning a number of years ago. So the Student Data Privacy Consortium, the idea was, you know, what we were able to do in Cambridge, like we heard earlier, all districts can't do that. So we wanted to share those practices and procedures, and, you know, it's just makes more sense instead of everyone trying to do that. So through the consortium, we were able to expand the tools we built, the idea of having a data privacy agreement that is standard across the country, and we now have alliances in 35 states across the country and 4 countries, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada as well. And here in the US, one of the biggest achievements was the creation of a national data privacy agreement that is being used in those 35 states. So it is a standard document with the ability to be, have some add-ons per state if needed, but at least, some of the vendors in the room I know have seen that document, and when they get it from one state or another state, they're getting the same instrument. The core clauses and requirements are the same, and it's much easier. The whole goal of the consortium is to be able to onboard applications quicker and easier, get them in the teacher's hands, and know that the data is being protected. So it's not just districts, it's bringing vendors and districts together to solve these operational issues. So the consortium is made up of vendors as well. So about 3 years ago, going beyond the legal side of having these standard data privacy agreements, we wanted to leverage the power of SDPC being part of Access for Learning. And so much talk was about increasing interoperability, and there was a concern about greater interoperability and exchanging of data without privacy protections is actually going to create more risk. So we spent a lot of time thinking about how can we integrate privacy into the interoperability. And 3 years ago, as part of the Unity infrastructure spec, and I'm not a very technical person, there was a standard for privacy over the wire that are called privacy obligation documents. So it's an actual XML file that can carry all the privacy metadata about the data that's being shared. So now we can convey, before we transfer data, what the obligations are and the requirements are to eventually create basically secure ecosystems. So it's one thing to get the document signed. It's another one for the vendor and their technical staff to really understand what the required controls and obligations are and sign off on that. Right now, it's kind of a voluntary acknowledgement, but eventually it could morph into more of a certification so that we could technically have a controlled ecosystem where these pods are being exchanged before data goes to the vendor to know that that data is being protected, really automating it further. Again, getting the applications in the hands of the teachers quicker. That is currently being done in a pilot in Massachusetts. Again, leveraging something Mark mentioned earlier, the SLDS in Massachusetts and their data collection, leveraging that to do a statewide kind of, it's called the Massachusetts Data Hub. So districts can leverage their state reporting data, add data to it, and take advantage of this centralized hub for sharing data with this privacy wrapper around it, so the pods can be exchanged. And then, a big piece of this is transparency. We heard a lot about trust. How do we build trust in our community with our parents? Initially, a transparency piece of the consortium is built right into the registry that holds all these DPAs, that districts can show what applications are being used in their district, what data is being shared, which students are using those applications, and have a link to the data privacy agreement that's in place. So districts that have been doing this for a while, that have a good size list of applications, parents can see what's going on. They understand the district is vetting apps. You're starting to build that trust that the parents aren't going to be pushing back as much and questioning everything you do. The Massachusetts Data Hub has the ability to go one step further, that you can write out a report of a particular student, what data elements are going to which application, and which specific obligations are covering which data elements based on those pods. So you could really get to a granular level if you've got a parent that really wants to know that level of detail, which every district has a few of those. So I know I've run through like 8 years worth of work in 10 minutes. So there's just a lot going on at the LEA level. There's some other projects of the SDPC around security to meet the privacy requirements and things like that. But I think I will stop there and pass it on to the next panelist.
Thank you. And is this clicker? So I do have a few slides. Okay, we'll wait just a second. Nice to meet you all. I'm not part of this crowd, so it's good to meet a whole bunch of new faces. I'm Andrew Rice. I'm CEO of Education Analytics. We're a nonprofit. We're based in Madison, Wisconsin. We work with school systems all over the country, whether that be LEAs or SEAs, sometimes in the federal research space. Is this? Okay. And what I would like to talk about today, with the sort of generalized prompt that I was given, is PPT and AI, is it ready or is it the future, right? And in particular, I was reading some of the materials that were being presented and talked about earlier today. And I want to kind of go through this issue of how do we get to the future? All right. So just something about us, we actually sit between two kind of industries in the education space. We're on the research side, so we'll interact with people like what Mark was talking about, this old school legacy sort of federal research industry. We also are in the education technology industry. It's a strange thing because that means we cross borders, both staff and kind of content that we talk about. So I have whole teams of data engineers, analytics engineers, software engineers, et cetera, and I have whole teams of research scientists, et cetera, who could be sitting within a university. And so the question is, how do you get research done when you have large-scale data systems, live data systems working? And the answer is, it's essentially impossible. From a management perspective, the cultures are way different. We talked about that earlier today. The structures of which those kind of teams are built are way different, and trying to unify them together is really what we've been trying to do. And I'd say we've gotten it kind of, sort of, but not really. And I'm involved in fights all the time about, well, I want to do this, and the technology, no, we can't do that. And so you may have seen some of these things. But what I want to talk about is actually, we heard a lot from the umbrella of the federal government. I want to talk about what does it look like at a district level. So we work with a lot of districts. And we talked about small districts, we talked about big districts. You know, the biggest districts in our country have budgets on the order of $20 billion a year. The smallest ones maybe don't even reach $1 million, right? It just depends on what's going on. And so you think about what's going on within those systems. The small districts have a single person, or maybe not even a single person, maybe the superintendent, who's trying to manage their data systems. And they have to manage data systems. Why? Because current education is digital. Right? So you imagine what kind of data is going in there? Well, you've got student information, you've got food service, you've got transportation, you've got da-da-da-da-da-da. How many? Does anyone have any idea how many systems the school system is looking at? That's on average about 150. Okay, so I've got an ecosystem inside a school district with 150 data systems with data flitting out, it's going all over the place, right? What do I do with it? Well, a researcher comes to me and they say, I want this data, and you're like, I gotta run the school system. Get off, I don't wanna talk to you. They say, well, I really need these specific, I need attendance and this and that. It's like, do you know how that data is stored within my systems? It is not stored the way you think it is. It's stored in this crazy system that only a computer scientist can understand. So if you're asking me to pull it, that's like a week, I gotta get someone to go do it, right? Okay, how do we deal with that? Well, one of the things that we thought about as we deal with this, and by the way, we used to be just more like, hey, can we get the data from you? And we were wondering, why do people keep yelling at us all the time? And so we figured that out, and we started to get heavily involved in enterprise data architecture, which is, as a researcher, not something I ever thought I would be involved in. And so what happens when you get involved in enterprise data architecture? Well, you start to think about security, you start to think about availability, you start to think about interoperability, you start to think about technology like APIs. We happen to be heavily involved in the EdFi community. EdFi is, and I encourage you all to go look at this, in the K-12 space, it's one of, although we just heard from another one, it's one of the main data transport and interoperability standards for K-12 education in the United States, mostly United States thing. It is a reference software implementation. What that means is they created a data standard, they created a transport standard, and they created a whole software stack that sits within a system that the school system can control. It's an open source piece of software. This is not a software as a service that someone's selling. This is an open source piece of technology. What it does is it tries to put all the data together inside a school system. And so we've gotten involved in the pursuit of, well, if we had one of these systems in every single district in the United States, what would happen? because these are well-structured open source systems. And so we've been working on that. But the problem is, this is a technology solution. There's a huge governance problem here. Does anyone know what a district actually is? Any guesses? I would just be like, what? It's a government. A public school system is a government. So we don't just have 16,000 school systems. We have 16,000 governments with their own legal policies and their own lawyers. And so the notion that we have a federal system and we can aggregate data up there, that's not true. You don't own that data at the federal level. You have to be given that data. You can't require it. And if you do try and require it, I guarantee you're gonna have senators on your back. So you gotta think about this from a question of, well, how do we provide value? All right, so the question there for us is then, well, we have these systems potentially within a school system, a government. A government needs governance of its data. And so how do we help people think about within a data neighborhood, and a data neighborhood we might consider K-12 system, along with its nonprofits and its after-school systems and other things inside the city or within its group, sort of thinking about how is it gonna transfer data between itself? And it doesn't know the answer to that question, by the way, typically. So that's the first thing. Then the second question is, this is our total data ecosystem in visuals. We've got early childhood, we've got K-12, we've got career and technical, workforce, researchers, right? By the way, researchers are like on the bottom of the barrel as far as priority most of the time. So I hate to say that, but it's usually true. As a researcher myself, also a fellow economist, like it just pains me, but it's true. We drew this picture on purpose. We've got all these data neighborhoods separated, and there's a river in between them, and there's all sorts of stuff. What are we gonna do about it? Well, what we've done so far is we built a series of dirt roads. You can sort of like transfer data by handing an Excel off. In between state and local, you can kind of get something going on. There are things like SIF, there are things like EdFi, other things. But the reality is if you want to transfer data between these, you have all sorts of problems from a political and from a legal and from a technical perspective, as was mentioned earlier today. But there are visions out there of what the next 10 years looks like, and 10 years is the minimum that we should be thinking about here. The first one is, within a state, maybe there's a data hub, right? And I would claim that this model, and it's being taken by several states right now, I'm not a fan of this model, personally. I think this model doesn't work, and I'll tell you why. So you got a bunch of data, like we're all put it at the state level, we're gonna centralize it, we're gonna combine it, and then we're gonna put PPT on top of it, and then people are gonna do AI on top of it, it's gonna be great. Well, where are you gonna get the staff to do that? If you're in California, for instance, who's trying to do this, do you know how close Silicon Valley is to Sacramento? Do you think you're gonna have the staff to be able to manage that? I hope so, but I'm not sure that will happen. And that is a very, very complicated socio-technical problem that we have to be very careful that we don't set that up as I think that we don't set that up as the solution and say, hey, go build that, because we've tried that before. We're kind of advocating for something a little different, which is, can we build infrastructure, policy infrastructure, governance infrastructure, software infrastructure that is shared? It's not actually systems that sit within the states or anywhere else for that matter. Can we build these things, and then can we create modern technologies like APIs and streaming technology that connects all of it together in ways that everyone understands is public, is transparent, is open, and that lets us send trains to each other, but only on the data that we are allowed to send to everyone else, right? Because, I mean, does anyone have any guess? I don't actually know. If anyone has a study on this, I would love to see it. My rule of thumb is 10% of the data in the local area goes to the state, and 10% of the data that's in the state goes to the federal government. So when we're talking about, Mark was talking about 235,000 tests, how many tests are taken in this country? Half a billion a year? Like, it's like this tiny amount. The federal government has almost no data, and they shouldn't, they don't own it, right? And so how do we get there? How do we get there? How do we get there? That's what I keep asking. And so what I would ask us, and then I'll stop, is, well, first of all, this is one state's problem. We can do all this cool stuff, right? We can do automatic record transfers. We can help, we can have teachers as researchers. We can do self-service credential, all sorts of things, right? But then we have to do it over and over again in every state. Oh, wait, and those states, and those states. How are we going to do it? And so I want PPT and AI to work, but there's this underlying rot in our system and the data infrastructure that it's going to take billions and billions of dollars to fix before we can really get to this, like, this thing that we all want, which is like, we want to learn, right? We want to get better. We want to do rapid cycle stuff. We want to do cool things. We think that at least one small piece of this is we can build reference software together that can help with all of this. And it can be pre-vetted with PPT and with other kinds of things. But it's going to take all of us. It's going to have to be open. We're going to have commercial partners. We're going to have government partners, foundation partners. We think it's possible. We've seen it possible in smaller scales. And it's one of the things that I wrote a blog in response to Mark's RFI. And I basically said, this is possibly the only solution, I think, to the SLDS 2.0 question. And it really means that the federal government has to be a partner. It can't run it. And that the states and the locals have to actually think about how to build all this stuff. So hopefully I didn't go too long. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Julia Fallon with SETDA. I represent U.S. state and territory digital learning and educational technology directors in all of the SEAs across our country, as well as the Department of Defense schools. We're a small but mighty group, as we always like to say. I was starting to think about what Amy said this morning about where my group would sit, and I feel like it would be the culture and the policy space. And I say this, before I joined SETDA as staff, I actually worked at the Washington State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction for 17 and a half years, so I'm well steeped in the SEA culture that is there. One of the things that we're trying to do as an association is really, as state leaders, right, is to figure out how we change the culture right now with school districts, and what you said is very true. They're just working what's in front of them, and their business is education, right? They want to educate. That's what they want to be doing. They don't want to spend their resources litigating something or whatnot, and they have parents. I'm one of those parents, by the way, identify that I get it. Show me your privacy policies. The culture thing is a big deal. And as you know, with state government, we are slow to move on purpose. It's not, it's a plus and a minus, but we need to be thinking about those things and how do we predict and foresee what's coming down the pike. So in the privacy space right now, cybersecurity is just where the attention is because it's making the newspaper test, right? We all talk about we don't want it in the newspaper, and there's things that are hitting the newspaper, and that's what they're dealing with, and they're trying not to be in the newspaper test. Most parents and most education systems, they are not trying to do the wrong thing, you know what I mean? They just don't know, or they are just focused on the things ahead. But cybersecurity seems to have everybody's attention. And what we're seeing is there's a huge underinvestment in the education sector as a whole, and everybody plays a part, right? Everybody plays a part. Teachers play a part, parents play a part, students play a part in protecting PII. And if you could do that and build trust, and they would be more apt to say, yeah, use the data. I don't care. As long as my kid is safe and there's no harms or there's no unintended bias against my kid, you can use the data. I just want to make sure that it's not going to be used or exposed or harm somebody down the line. So one of the things that we talk about is there's just an underinvestment relative to the larger and private, private in the education sector, and that we need to, it's not in alignment with the rest of the sectors, right? It's just not. And people aren't thinking about it. The other thing is to build that capacity of educators and school professionals to protect PII. As a parent, I have my parent hat on right now. How many field trip forms I fill out where I have to provide healthcare information, like immunization stuff, my healthcare card? Is that necessary? I mean, and then they have 35 pieces of paper. I'm talking about low-level stuff. They put it in their backpack when they take the kids down to the museum, and then I don't know where that backpack of stuff goes. I don't know if there's a different way of figuring out what data needs to be where, and you just need to know if I give permission. Make it my job as a parent to update in the system the other information that you need in case there's an emergency. But the PII is all over the place, and who needs what access to what data? A bus driver likely does not need to have access to a full student record, whereas an administrator or a researcher or something could have more access depending on what's happening. But if you could build a better understanding of those privacy best practices, I think that you would have more people willing to actually have the data in the system to be using. I just do. I think there's like, it's a culture thing. And just giving new requirements to states and school districts is going to fail without some of the resourcing and the compliance thing, the effective compliance will fail. The other thing that I have a note here for myself is, we do have like the technical, the Privacy Technical Assistance Support Center. They provide excellent support. It's just that we need to expand to that, in essence. A greater investment in PTAC would pay, I think, huge privacy dividends in the education sector. And again, it's managing that culture change. I often in SETDA circles will talk about how do we create a system where if you're a vendor or you're a state person that you are doing all those things, you're seen as the cool kid so that you want to be in the club versus the other way, right? That if you don't have certain tenants built into your products or tenants built into your systems, we don't want to hang out with you in essence, right? You're going to be the outlier versus the opposite. So how do we shine lights on the systems that are doing well, incorporating things, making it not a burden on a district or on a state to sort of do that thing. We see, in terms of the AI space, we see it as a way to free up teachers. There's a way to do some low-level tasks that technology and AI can afford the system, and then that will allow teachers to have more time to actually do the thing they do best, which is working with students. And we're still relatively, as state leaders, trying to figure out what that really means for us in the space, specifically in the policy space. So we're just kind of watching. I always talk about trains coming in. That's like maybe a train that's 4 or 5 down. Right now it's the cybersecurity train. The privacy train is coming into the station. We know that that needs to be worked on. We need a national policy. It can't be California gets to do California. And then I'm like, well, what if I want to do California? Like, well, you're not in California. So then the vendors, like, they don't, I'm like, why are you not? We need a standard and one that's comprehensive and that protects minors. We're not talking about adults. That's the thing that people forget too, is these are minors. And it's a whole other space when it comes to K-12 versus higher education and post-secondary. And I think, and one thing I want to talk about is information architecture. I'm struggling with this I have an internal thing that's going on. I'm like, God, I wish people would just think about how they label their data and how they look at their data and in some ways create those manuals that go alongside. So when you use this label, why do you use this label? Not just label it because it causes, we're collecting the same data in multiple places, and I think that we could do a better job if we had those sort of standards things that we mean the same things when we're passing through systems and whatnot. The interoperability is a huge thing. And I know Aaron Moat from Innovate EDU would give me bonus points for actually even saying that on this panel. So I think I'll leave it at that and everything else. Yeah, SEA, we definitely have, it's managing the culture change, I would say, is the biggest thing, biggest challenges for us.
I think it's me now. Everyone deals with email database issues. I've been trying to clean up our email database issues for years now, and I feel like it's just a constant calendar item. It just stays. Hi everyone, my name is Sara Kloek. I am the Vice President of Education and Children's Policy at SIIA. SIIA is the Software and Information Industry Association. We're a trade association for the information industry. So we represent a number of different companies, but education technology is one of those buckets. So we represent technology companies that are making products for schools, some of the big guys in the room and some of the little guys with 1 or 2 people on staff, if they even have a payroll. So I work to explain what policymakers are doing to our education technology companies and help explain what our education technology companies are doing to policymakers. And it has gotten more and more interesting. I've been there for 5 years, and it gets more and more interesting as time goes by. Obviously, the pandemic has made everyone think that education technology is this new thing that has never existed before, that, wow, look at all these companies that are collecting data on my students. And then when I explain, well, education technology has been around since when I was in school, and I am not 18 anymore, so it's been around for a while, and explaining just the very basics. I'm still explaining that there's a difference between, and I'm going to use proper nouns here, there's a difference between the PBS Kids app and what Renaissance Learning is building. PBS Kids typically doesn't contract with a school district, isn't subject to all of the student data privacy laws. Renaissance Learning, and I'm using it because Renaissance Learning is in the room, typically contracts with the school, is subject to those student data privacy laws, needs to figure out how to build within those, is subject to protecting the data under FERPA, state student privacy laws, those district laws, as we're talking about those those thousands of little governments across the country that are setting up their own rules and regulations, figuring out how to navigate all of those. And policymakers still to this day don't understand that. I was testifying at a hearing earlier this year in a state. One of the state senators said, why don't we just use paper and pencil? So it's a interesting dynamic. It's ever evolving, but it's always very much the same in that policymakers are only going to understand what they choose to understand and choose to engage on. So it's up to me and others like Julia to explain what we're doing on a daily basis. So when we're talking about things like AI or privacy enhancing technology, that's scary for a lot of these policymakers. There was a bill introduced in one state that would ban the use of algorithms for children under the age of 18, and just algorithms, not anything. And that's funny to people in this room, but it's not funny to policymakers because they think algorithms are scary. No one has explained to them what that is. And so the conversation earlier on one of the earlier panels about how we come up with a common language, how are we approaching this, how are we making this accessible for people that may not want to take the time to learn about it, and how do we make it make sense to those of us that are in it? How are we making sure we're talking about laws and regulations that are actually implementable? How do we respond to the stakeholders that are in the room? Stakeholders being not just the superintendents, not just the state officials, but the parents, the children that are using the technologies. I mean, you'll see students breaking their monitoring software, breaking their various things. How do you make sure that the stakeholders there are understanding the technology that is being used? And I think particularly for technology that is collecting data and using personally identifiable information, making sure that that is understood by those that are using the technology is particularly important. It makes my job easier when it's explained and understood. There's a couple points from earlier that I wanted to touch on and make sure that folks in the room are aware of it. I also consider my role in a lot of this is scaring folks in the room. So that's why I mentioned the algorithm bill. I'll mention the White House blueprint for the AI Bill of Rights came out last week. We think that that's a really important step for the discussion, but I think that it's very important, in particular with the mentions of education, that not only will that document be used by policymakers as they're building out policies around AI, but it's important that, and I know OET is working on their own AI work, but it's very important that we have one specific in the education sector, because I think that it's a very unique sector. Again, PBS Kids is not necessarily what we're thinking about when we're thinking about education technology, or at least that's not how I'm thinking about it. Also, with all of these privacy laws, Bill of Rights, I'm going to a privacy conference later this week in Texas, and I think that you can have one privacy law and dozens of interpretations of it. So there's never anything that is, I mean, these folks, everyone in this room has been referring to themselves as very nerdy. You get into a room of privacy professionals, they're pretty nerdy too. And they really like to talk about their different interpretations of privacy laws. So it makes it hard as technologists to implement some of those laws that those privacy professionals are working on, passing. Just the most important is that I always bring to the policymakers is it's really important to avoid unintended consequences. Where there was a law in Louisiana, a student privacy law that would have penalized teachers for handling PII wrong. We don't want to throw teachers in jail. That's not our goal. And I don't think it's policymakers' goals either. But it's the reality of how policymakers are approaching some of this. There's also, there was a Federal Trade Commission case earlier this year that I think is important to flag for this room as well, the FTC versus Kerbo. Kerbo was a Weight Watchers app. The agreement said that Kerbo needed to delete all of the data that they collected and also delete the algorithms or destroy the algorithms that were built using that data. And it's not an ed tech app. It was a Weight Watchers app for children. We can set aside the discussion about that for lunchtime, but the company collected data, did not do it within the bounds of the law, so the FTC said, you got to delete that data and delete those algorithms. So as we're looking at this technology and looking at this, looking at PETs and looking at AI, understanding that everything needs to happen within those privacy laws that have dozens of interpretations by privacy professionals and lawyers. This is a hard space. It's not easy. It's always changing. There were dozens of student privacy laws introduced last state legislative session. There's already bills getting introduced. I talked on a Massachusetts panel a month ago. I'm talking on a panel in Pennsylvania in a few weeks. There's always changing. There's no strict national, I mean, we would love a national law, but the reality is FERPA is the floor for student data privacy protection. States can add on top of that. I mean, we all can dream, but I'm here to shatter those dreams. I can talk all day about this, but I know the panelists here are doing good work, and we're all in this together to figure it out. It's not easy. There's a bunch of stakeholders. We need to respect and value all the voices that are at the table, and even those that aren't at the table.
Great, thanks. And I'm just going to just introduce Maria and let Maria know she's on for the last portion here. So thanks for joining us, Maria. Go ahead. Hold on, Maria, you're on mute. We're working on a technical issue. Hold on a second.
That might have been my fault. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. You're doing great.
Oh,
Keep it up.
great. Sorry about that. Might have been my fault. You know, those of us at Microsoft also have technical challenges sometimes. But really wanted to thank all of you for inviting me to this, and to the other panelists. Really loved what you had to say, and am struggling to think of what I can add to that. I mean, the themes this morning that I've been able to hear around data governance, around the necessity of building trust, about the challenges around capacity building around data and AI, those are all the same things that we're seeing, not just in the United States, not just for national research challenges, but globally across K through 12, higher ed, into labor market analysis. And there is, these are the meta themes that we all face. And I sit in a very interesting seat. I think we as Microsoft, as you know, during the pandemic, as an education technology platform provider, was one of the fastest growing usage of the Teams platform. We went from about 10 million users to about 110 million in about 2 months. And And during that time, we really saw the urgency of the need for better use of data in education systems globally. And that urgency was really, for myself, very welcome. I have a background in education research, sociology, and had worked with education system change with groups like Michael Fallon and the Gates Foundation, and had seen, and in and out of Microsoft during that time, and had seen the different cultures around data and the use of data at all layers of an education system, from that, that school-based system to a state to a national system. And also seeing data cultures inside of Microsoft, and the pace and the urgency and the expectation of how you use data, when you use data, is so vastly different. And we had customers all around the world, from Helsinki to Tasmania, asking us for help going on this data and AI journey. And so we put together this program called Open Education Analytics. Many of the folks in this room have contributed greatly to the formation of that organization. It's an open source program with education systems around the world, seeking to develop that common reference architecture for data and AI in their own education data environments. So within their own LEA, within their own states, it's not a service as much as helping them build their own capacity for their own use cases. Out of that, we've seen, so there's now about 128 education systems from around the world that are part of this community. And they've spanned from K through 12 systems to higher ed, and national ministries of education in some cases. And we've learned a lot. And one of the things I see as the most challenging is we're at an awkward stage in data use in education, where there's a lot of high aspirations. And the reality of the situation is, a lot of the things that Andrew said, that they are, there's not a common identity for students, even within an individual LEA. It's, and then if you try to, address things like learner records that can help transfer data as children or adults move across systems and organizations, it becomes incredibly challenging. At the same time, when you try to build, accurate predictive models, it's the paradigm of education research gets challenged, because you can't take, generally, if you're trying to take data out of an education system, say an LEA, you can only take certain pieces out of it with privacy preserving technologies. But the reality is, in any classroom, in any school, there's a very diverse ecosystem of data that you need to account for if you're going to build any kind of accurate predictive model. And no education system that I've seen has been able to reach a level of accuracy in their predictive models that they're comfortable really starting to use an AI system. So an example is Tasmania. The State Department of Education in Australia worked with us to try to build a predictive model of vulnerable students, of students who face significant risk outside of the school that would impede their learning. And we captured a lot of data. We set up this open education analytics type of data environment, and had maybe 50 different data sources. But the thing that we were trying to predict of vulnerable students, the data quality of that data was so low that you couldn't build a predictive model with any degree of accuracy. And we see this, and so the learning was they need to go back to the drawing board and improve the quality of that data, train teachers on how to do those assessments. We see that same pattern over and over and over again. And it's the data culture, the data governance piece, all the way through the system that is, so as a result, it's very hard to build successful use cases that can build trust. And it's a layered system. And I think the conversation in this room that the room that you're in, is so necessary to making progress on this. And I hope that we can work in ways where there's a true partnership between organizations like those represented in your room and groups like Microsoft that have capacity, but don't often have the experience or the knowledge base of the complexity of education data. I will say one thing before I go is I think of all the issues that we've talked about today, governance, capacity, et cetera, the biggest challenge is the vision of education that we are all seeking to achieve. And what data has a way of reinforcing existing patterns in education, or it can be used to drive innovation. And we need to think, I think, as a combined collective around what is it we're trying to achieve with data for every learner. And, you know, we see so many indicators that the education systems in the United States, especially at the higher ed level, are going to be going through massive transformation that's already underway over the next decade or so. And are we doing data strategies in a way that is going to, you know, provide equity in that change? Are we doing data strategies that are going to address the growing diversity of pathways through our education systems? How do our data strategies affect, you know, those labor market connections? I'll close with a good book recommendation. If anybody hasn't yet heard of After the Ivory Tower Falls, a book that came out about 3 months ago, strongly recommended. It talks about the political dimensions of this shift in higher ed and the history of higher ed. Because even if you're working in a K through 12 system, you know, the data that is going to address that inflection point between the K through 12 system and, you know, the higher ed pathways is going to be incredibly important. And anyway, sorry, I rambled a bit, but really open to further discussion on this and developing ideas about how we can all work together. And folks on the panel, I will be reaching out to some of you. Loved what you said today.
Great, thank you very much, Maria. As people are thinking of questions in the room as well as virtually, please put it in the Q&A and we will recite it back. But if you do have a question, raise your hand. We'll run a microphone to you. One thing I'll note, as Maria just said about reaching out to people, the follow-up email all of you receive as registrants will include the name and email addresses for everybody that is here. So you'll be able to follow up directly and easily with that. Give it a moment for any more questions. Oh, we have a question over here with Rich. If you want to, again, reminder, introduce yourself, please. And Lauren will let us know if anything comes in on Q&A.
I'm Rich Silva. I do analytics and adaptive AI work with colleges and universities, primarily. I was thinking about the statement you made about the algorithm law, and thinking just as a general rule, I classify that as reactionary policy. It's policy based around this happened and we need to make sure that never happens again. And reactionary policy is inevitably bad policy. But in the absence of any real structure around, and this is why the work of the EdSafe AI Alliance is so important, in the absence of any real structure around this is what should be done and this is how it should be done, the vacuum that is created in that absence invites all kinds of reactionary policy, right? And then in your example, most egregiously, that legislation ends up getting written by, you get technology legislation written by the paper and pencil guy. So what do you see as the path towards filling that vacuum with best practices and guidelines and structures that become kind of a bulwark against a lot of this reactionary one-off, you know? And just as a quick aside, Andrew, I forgive you for lumping us researchers in with the policymakers in your slide. But I'm just interested to hear what you think the solution path is to establish these practices and structures that will kind of help keep us away from more reactionary type policies.
So it's really difficult right now, especially in the tech space. Tech is not a trusted entity, and it is not something that is understood. I think a lot of the work that has been done is look at this shiny object that is going to be the Uber for X, Y, and Z. And I think that policymakers are sick of that and don't really want to listen to that anymore. But I also think that there's a huge diversity in policymakers that are coming at writing laws and passing laws all from their own unique perspective. And that unique perspective is reflective of their districts that they represent. So what works in a rural area in Indiana, a law that's introduced, or proposed, and maybe eventually passes in Indiana, may not work in New York City. But as education technology companies, I'll speak on behalf of the industry here. When you're building something, you aren't necessarily building it for that one rural district in Indiana. You're building it for the entire US. Or that's your aspiration anyways. You would love to sell it to every single school district in the US. So I think with my work, explaining things without that shiny object, without that, and just getting down into the nitty-gritty and explaining an algorithm can be something that is used to sort email. That bill didn't pass. But there was another bill introduced in that same state that would have allowed a student to opt out of a piece of technology in a classroom. So that a student could opt out of a student information system. How would that work? How would that work for taking attendance, the reporting duties for that school, if that student decides to, nah, I don't want to be a part of that student information system? So we had to explain that might not be a great idea, but if you put some guardrails around what data that technology company can access, what they can do with that data, that's a more forward-looking approach so that students can still attend school, still have their privacy protected. So that's the approach that we're taking. It doesn't always work. People sometimes will be like, yeah, we don't want to hear from you. But it's hard right now. It's not. And everyone thinks they understand education policy because they attended school at one point. So an education policy is not an accessible thing to understand. It's very difficult, and you have to take the time to learn it. And some people don't want to do that. So making sure that we're patient or I'm patient is one of the things I have to do this next year.
I was going to add that we need to shift the responsibility to the front office and not be the IT shop. So this is a business risk analysis that needs to be taking place. So your superintendents need to understand what is happening. They can't just say, well, the IT guy is going to take care of it for me. You know what I mean? Like it needs to be shifted from the IT, because it's digital, doesn't believe that it sits in IT. It needs to go to the front office. And it's part of doing business of schools. And that's what a superintendent is hired for, to do the business of schools. So what do they need to know in order to do that? And as state leaders, we also need to understand, right, how it impacts the front office sort of thing. So I think there has to be that shift as well that would then cut down on this kind of crazy bills that would come out, because they're being reactionary and they are trying to avoid the newspaper test. They really are.
And I also, whenever I am talking to policymakers, I say, you could fund some of this so that the state agencies have money to help train folks to implement these laws. And they're like, let's not talk about funding. Let's just talk about banning algorithms. So
If I could jump in here, I would love to add, we see patterns internationally in terms of the effect that fears about privacy have on innovation and the effective use of data. Just in international collaboration we see very few effective members from the European Union that are doing innovative things. And when they do get involved, like there's a consortium of universities in Spain that are looking at collecting a lot of data in a common way, building algorithms to protect student success. And when the vendor got involved and said, hey, we could show these types of dashboards to students that reflect, a comprehensive picture of the student's progress, the university said, no, we don't want the students to know that we have that much data about them. So we're only going to provide dashboards at the class level to professors. And alternatively, places like Australia are very innovative, have spent a lot of time and energy on data governance and build trust into their systems, and are able to do very innovative things. We see that they're kind of at the forefront of the use of data for education. And the United States is kind of somewhere in the middle, and the exact kind of things that Sara is talking about are going to play out in terms of whether privacy concerns stop us from using data effectively or delay us for the next 10 years, or whether we can create some examples, some trust-based systems that allow the national dialogue essentially to make some progress around the use of data in education.
And I know we're still answering the same question, but another idea or perspective is if we can be proactive in setting the guardrails and guidance that gets adopted by this community, that I think a lot of these laws are written in absence of anything else, So if there was some adopted guidance around the use of AI or the proper way to do it that can be referenced, right, in the laws and point the policymakers to those. Similarly, I mentioned briefly the idea of security standards. That's what's happening in the state laws that are being passed. Each one is coming up with a different set of security controls to protect education data. So we're going to end up with 50 different sets of security controls pointing to NIST, SIIA, et cetera. So we are trying to get out in front of that and create a global education security standard that we can all agree on as a community and just say, this is it, right? And with enough momentum, that's what the laws will point to. And that is including UK members in Australia. We're leveraging this Australian Safer Technology for Schools control set already and building upon that. So I think if we can do that with the control sets, maybe eventually the laws will reference that and not have a variety of different controls.
Can I add one more thing? I just want to reiterate a point that sometimes is missed in education, because sometimes we think about, oh, how do we stop these bad policies, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen this in healthcare, we've seen this everywhere else. 16,000 governments. Think about the highest number of elected officials in this country, our school board members, almost certainly. They sometimes have politics that have nothing to do with these policies. And that's what sometimes makes this so hard. And so I think Jem earlier was talking about the diversity of our education system. In the US, we almost can't use Argentina, Australia, et cetera. Like we can't, because you're dealing with these micro governments. How do you get them all to go on the same page? I don't know. But I think that's what we have to do. I will say that, again, all software is, if we can build it, is a set of policy rules written into code, right? And so if we can get a set of software technologies that people can agree on, then we can kind of maybe quiet some of that.
Great. Please join me in saying thank you to our panelists, Maria virtually, and those in the room. Just kind of that last conversation really was a great segue to this afternoon. So this morning was an excellent morning. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did in terms of the diversity of conversation, the themes, and the practical applications that are occurring. This afternoon, we're going to continue with kind of a perspective from the international world. So a little bit from those, like Maria just referenced, other countries or international bodies that are thinking about this with the Broadband Commission Data for Learning Working Group and UNESCO, We'll hear specifically about some research and development ideas and opportunities that people are thinking about. And we'll close with kind of one of those alliances or groups that's thinking about how do we establish shared frameworks, benchmarks, ultimately standards that can help increase trust in the marketplace. So with that, continue the discussions over lunch. Lunch is available. We'll start back up at 1:15. All three panelists are virtual, and Borhin and Manolis are over in Europe, so we'd like to get them